le ha llevado estos años a trabajar tanto como director artístico como director técnico, como en Framestore.
And these two came to work both as a technical director and as an art director for studios like Framestore, ILM, Disney, and others. He worked in video games, visual effects, animated features in a time span of about 20 years. So we have here Mauro, and he will be talking with this extended time slot available about many things, about his experience, about the workflows, the pipelines of different industries, and their convergence. And so without further ado, let's have a round of applause and let the presentation start.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna speak in English, but later you can ask me questions in the language you prefer, just to be a little bit faster, because this is a bit of a packed talk. The convergence of movies and games is a very hot topic these days. You hear a lot of things, and so we're gonna try to give a little bit more of organization to this. This is a bit of a weather talk, weathercast type of talk, where I'm not gonna put down any Nostradamus type of sort of prophecy, but you're hopefully gonna walk away with some organic view and some good perspectives. There is the mixed audience, as always here, but this talk is a little bit more geared towards professionals. So if you've never been in the industry or you're a student, just try to keep up. Some of the things we're gonna be a little bit intense. So as an audience, it's up to you to hear what I'm gonna go through and connect the dots, because I'm gonna be talking about games, I'm gonna be talking about movies, and the way they're converging together. In a good way. You're gonna hear symmetries and similarities across the scope, and so I'm gonna go fast. Just stay with me. All right. Quick introduction. My name is Mauro, and I am co-founder and creative director of a company called Treehouse Ninjas, which is a hybrid studio creating contents for both movies and games. And we are currently busy on Cyberpunk 2077, helping our friends at CG Projekt Red building Night City. Okay, so this is a hefty presentation, but I hope it's really rich in valuable contents, okay? I've split it into 8 chapters. The first one is this introduction. In the second, we'll see how we built all the environments for the Heretic short movie. Then we will start looking at parallels between movies and video games. And specifically in the third chapter, we will look at the history, at the timeline, the compared timeline of movies and video games. In the fourth chapter, we will see how the technology is involved into this convergence of games and movies. In the fifth chapter, we will look at the comparison between the movie grammar and video games grammar. Then in the sixth chapter, we will look at workflows, how workflows are converging in movies and in video games. The seventh will be about the workforce, so employment in movie and game industries. And the eighth will be some thoughts about the future. Let's say that each one of these chapters, it's its own circle that makes sense on its own, but eventually all of them together, they compose a broader circle that hopefully gives a better and more enlightening vision of the future. I will spend a few words about my professional history because it's important to set the background for the talk. I will keep it short. I would like to emphasize how things have changed since the years when I started my career to today, to draw a line so that we can anticipate how things might be changing in the future. When I started, it was the late 90s, early 2000s, and obviously things were very much different from today. But the main thing was that it was so much more difficult to learn the craft because the resources available were just little compared to today. Right, no streaming videos, basically almost no internet, no training. Especially in Europe, it wasn't considered a viable career path. It wasn't that much popular to say, hey, I want to make video games or movies as a career. And as a matter of fact, I was so lost when I was younger that I ended up doing, at university I did physics, because originally I wanted to be a game programmer. But then I started developing sensitivity and more passion for the artistic side, and then I moved to fine arts, to the Academy of Fine Arts, and everybody thought that I was crazy, and I myself thought, what the hell am I doing with my future? But now today it makes perfect sense, because all of the things that I learned, I did 2 years of physics at university, and all of the things that I learned there, they come together in terms of all the technicalities that are involved in computer graphics. And it helped me to understand how much I liked the balance between the technical side versus the artistic side of what we do. And also, approaching companies was much more difficult because there was no recruitment processes were not set up to work online. Actually, the way you would apply to a company was to send a hard copy of your showreel, meaning a CD-ROM or even a VHS, and then hope that somebody would get back to you. However, because of this, the industry itself was much less crowded. If you got to step in the industry and get a job, then you would be one of the few chosen ones, and you could, feel much more unique and valuable and protected in your stability for your career. Now, today is literally the opposite. It's so much easier to learn. There is training material everywhere. There are schools. But then things become harder once you step into the industry, or even to step into the industry, because the competition is so much more fierce. There are so many more people that are fighting for entry-level positions especially, that it really becomes vital to develop your own uniqueness as a professional, your own unreplaceable value inside of the industry for what you do and how well you do it and the way you do it. And I really hope that the contents of this talk will help in that direction, right? To try to anticipate the times that are coming and stimulate the right thoughts in the direction of create fresh and valuable contents, which applies equally to professionals in the industry as much as new companies as well, because as much as there are lots of people getting entry-level jobs in the industry, there are also lots of young companies willing to shine in the industry, and the current scenario, it's starting to be crowded with the same things over and over. And for a young company, the idea of blending alone, yes, can bring safety, meaning establishing cash flow and all of that. But in the long run, if you want to shine, you're gonna have to come up with something that has a value. You want to deserve your spotlight. Now, long story short, I started my career in games, but then fairly soon I shifted to movies. And that was because of a bunch of different reasons. Back then, movies was, at least to me, more attractive. Given the technology of the time, the difference between what you could achieve in terms of graphics in a video game or in a movie were massive, of course. So you could do so much more cooler and more detailed stuff in movies. In general, was also more glamorous back then. If you would cross somebody on the street and would ask you, what's your job? To say, I work in movies was just cooler than saying to work in video games, which is flipped. I mean, today is not the case anymore, I have to say. But back then it was like that. And for a young person that starts, these kind of things, they do matter, as much as now it might sound trivial. The point that I would like to make is that back then, because of the technology, because of how different were the workflows between making a movie and making a video game, changing from an industry to another was a sort of a black or white choice. You wouldn't bounce in and out that easily. And we will talk later about how this is now changed. But back then, with a video game portfolio, you would very, very hardly get a job in movies, and with a background in movies, you would not get a job in video games. So eventually, I moved first into high-end commercials, and then I got my first jobs in the movie industry. I did the classic visual effects artist nomadic life, traveling around the planet from project to project, from continent to continent. And it was great. I had the opportunity to work on some of the highest level franchises, and I had the opportunity to work side by side with some of the best artists and supervisors in the industry. I've also been always a very curious person. I started as a generalist, but then eventually I started wearing multiple hats, specializing in look development and lighting. I even been a character animator. And then I evolved into an environment artist until the point when I became a sequence lead and then an art director. Had the chance to be involved into great movies, stuff like this, and also into cool game cinematics like these ones, up until I started questioning things. And that started happening in my head during the huge VR bubble. It was around 2014, 2015 that I started questioning how long will people be happy about passively looking at stories told by pictures moving inside of a square on a flat screen when there is the opportunity to step inside of the story and live it in first person. And so this man came to my mind, and he was Marshall McLuhan, and amongst many clever things that he said, he made a distinction between warm media and cold media, where cold media are the ones that tell you a story in a very low senses stimulation sort of way, meaning that they don't stimulate your senses very much. Like, for example, a book, it's simply text printed on paper. It doesn't stimulate your sense, and as such, it relies on your brain to put the storytelling together, to create the images. It requires your activity. On the other side, the warm medias are warm. They overwhelm you with sensorial stimulation. You get audio, you got video, you got motion, you got lots of stuff, like a movie, for example. You, as an audience, are allowed to be much more passive. And the result is that cold media, they really tie a lot with the actual personality of the audience. Music, for example, is also a cold medium because it only gives you auditory stimuli, right? It's just sound. And as a matter of fact, it's very abstract. So the same song that you might listen and might trigger feelings of happiness in a certain moment of your life, then if you listen to it 15 years later, when that moment of your life is over, might trigger the opposite feelings, might trigger feelings of melancholy, of even downright sadness. And that is the value of a communication that relies a lot on the personality and the contribution of who listens, of the audience. While a movie can spawn certain similar magic sometimes, but generally the experience that you live watching a movie, it's really the same if you watch it over and over, or if two different people are watching the same movie, they're gonna feel very similar experiences out of it. While two people that read the same book, which is a cold media, they might spawn very different imageries that relate more to the specific background and life experiences that each one of us has in their lives, right? Now, sometimes this might also be the case with movies, those kind of movies that leave you thinking when they end. They really don't close their story and leave it up to your brain to connect the dots and have some thinking about them. But when we're talking about entertainment contents and visual effects driven movies, which is mainly what we're focusing about in this talk, that formula is not really that much of a common one. So all of these thoughts, convoluted sounding maybe, but they got me reevaluating video games in general as I started seeing how video games, they really relate much more to cold media. So those ones who really have a potential of involving the audience as a part of the storytelling, which comes from the interactivity factor. And for somebody who has made movies all of his career, of course, this is the factor that becomes an object of desire. It can suddenly open lots of new doors. So with this thing in mind, I just came back to Europe and set up my own studio. I did this crazy thing with a friend, my co-founder Zoltan, who is a veteran of the game industry. While I've been a long time in the movie industry, we thought, let's do something hybrid. Let's do something that we do movies and games together, but when we do games, I bring in the story-driven movie-like approach. And if we are doing movies, let's see if we can invest in game technology and bring that kind of clever solutions. We worked on many AAA contents, and it was awesome. We're specializing in environments. So basically, normally are involved into high-end content, and we take part of the design stage all the way through the lining stage, we craft the stories with an environment that accommodates for the storytelling. At one point of this process, Unity comes in and called us, and he told us that we want to make a movie with a game technology and you guys should be on board, and we said yes, and we went for it. So the goal was to push the boundaries of what can be achieved with the Unity engine, and that's what normally the Unity demo team is responsible for. This is the same team that created shorts like Adam or Book of the Dead, and it's a team of industry veterans basically called to create the most awesome possible stuff, utilizing both the already available Unity tools and the ones that are still in development and not yet released. So also representing the first line of users before tools get released to everybody. And for the Heretic project, they called us at Treehouse Ninjas to develop the environments for the short. So from an environmental storytelling standpoint, the first most important bullet points that we put down were: we wanted to, clue by clue, unveil the connection between the two characters, which are mysterious to us at the beginning. We wanted to lead the audience by triggering its curiosity to explore the next location as we progress to the story. We want to pre-end with a sense of satisfactory discovery by a panoramic vista of an overwhelming scale. And then we want to end with a cliffhanger that would leave the audience waiting for more. You know, that kind of feeling like, please give me more, make a full feature movie out of it, or make a series out of it. And the process was literally put in the same room people from the game industry, people with the movie industry, from the movie industry, and say, let's just make a cool movie. And this is what we made. And so what you're about to see runs real time on any average graphic card, 30 frames per second.
This is the place? Doesn't look like much. Go take a look. Yeah, got it. Okay, here we go. So who exactly is this guy? You're kidding. They're a fairy tale, Boston. Don't be an idiot. I see it. Open it. Wait. Do it. actually real. This makes no sense to me, Boston. But you might happen to be right.
All right, then thank you. Muchas gracias. So, what we have here, let's break it down really quickly. We start in a semi-abandoned basement through a sewerage tunnel where a magic portal appears that leads to a cave passage, which opens into a vast open cave with a vista over a huge citadel. To understand better the scale of the whole place, here you see in green, that is the basement part of the short. And if we zoom closer, you can understand better. Everything here is built in real scale. There are no per-shot adjustments. We are simulating a real set with the idea that later on our shooting crew with actors would virtually jump in the set and with handheld virtual cameras shoot the performance. Zooming in a bit closer, you see there is an outside city here, which is also real geo, like we said before, no matte paintings here. We have first the main corridor after the entrance, where the story starts. Then the character turns left, and there is a second corridor. And after the double door, there is a sewerage tunnel. That is where the portal transformation effects takes place. So we have three main environments. One is the basement, the second one is the rock passage, and the third one is the huge citadel for the final shot. Let's list the challenges that we went through for each segment. So at the very beginning outside we have a city, which wasn't meant to be seen too many times, so the challenge here was to try and get it done effectively, but without wasting too many resources on it. And what you have on the right are the paintovers and work-in-progress concepts by Georgi Simeonov of the Unity demo team. Now, the basement is a fairly complex environment in terms of there are many assets in it. We originally planned to scan the whole environment, but then we bumped into a bunch of problems related with safety of the conditions in this kind of environments. Lighting conditions were very difficult for scanning and photogrammetry. So in the end, we decided to go for modeling custom-made assets, which also gave us the flexibility of prepping them to get broken in pieces later when the characters are passing and interacting with them. Being very rich in details, this environment required a huge set of decals and a lot of smaller scattering elements to layer up the complexity and the dressing of the place. The lighting conditions were meant to be very dynamic. The plan was to have these floating point lights that were traveling along with the bird. And because of this, we never knew until the very end which elements of the environment were going to be seen very clearly and which others were meant to stay in the shadow. So eventually, to leave the flexibility to delay these decisions later after experimentation with cameras and character performance, we went through the assets, treating them, each one of them as if it was a hero asset, just to make sure that eventually, based on which directorial decisions were going to be taken, they would have held up to the expected quality. The basement is also a tight place, and so he had to give this feeling of some oppressive location, but at the same time he needed to be used for the motion capture performance. So at the same time we had to balance decision making between this feeling of oppressive and enclosed and very busy environment with having an actor being able to act inside of it. And this same consideration was also valid for the final composition of the shot. Normally these very busy and messy environments are prone to result into very cluttered composition. So we had to be careful about the sizing, all of the elements to create a nice hierarchy of non-competing shapes and scales, which we are going to look into detail a little bit later. And then there was the rock passage environment. Now, the rock passage was meant to serve as a landing picture for the transformation effect. And so there were a few scale framing and composition considerations that we had to keep in account. But Cyril Jover and the Unity tech team managed to develop the whole transformation effects in a way that allowed us to work without specific constraints, because in the end the transformation effects worked independently from the environment. Now, the whole place is built with several scanned rock patches that were thought to give flexibility while assembling the place. So it was not one single frozen mesh of the organic shape of the place, but it was a combination and a mix and match of different lattice deformable patches of rock, generally oscillating between a scale of like 3 by 3 meters up to 10 by 10 meters. And this is again to preserve flexibility for the later stages of production, to still mold and recompose the environment based on the cameras and based on the lighting and based on the intended composition of the final picture. The passage had a slope. It was a climb up, so we had to be very careful, because when there is a motion capture performance being recorded on a non-perfectly flat surface, the weight shifting of the actor needs to be simulated based on the slope. Still, in terms of storytelling, in the passage, we wanted to achieve some foreshadowing of the Citadel elements, so having some of the Citadel elements peeking out from the distance to sort of start to trigger some curiosity in the audience of what was going to happen next. And in this specific environment, we experimented with these hand-shaped rock formations, which you actually don't get to see in the final cut, and then I'm gonna speak about later a bit more. And then in the end, we decided to keep a triangular composition in the whole section of the environment to just keep a sort of a geometrical consistency to the whole storytelling. And this, again, is going to come back in a minute. And by the way, in the end, we decided to open up the ground and have this sort of rock bridge because it was looking more interesting to us. The cave and the Citadel. Now, this place was huge. It's 2 kilometers long, 500 meters tall, and there are lots of reconformed and scanned rock patches. Now, this one was tricky to compose because every element is organically interconnected, right? So the passage which leads to the gate is organically connected to the sides of the cave, and then everything sits on the ground. The Citadel is sitting on the ground, but then the ground connects with the sides of the cave, which closes the shapes in the ceiling, which it has got these pits that serve as a light source and at the same time as background for the focal elements of the architecture. And we were also using the ceiling in the foreground as a sort of a vignette for the final shot. However, at the end, a decision was made to crack the ceiling open and expose the sky in the very final shot. And another challenge here was that the vista shot is actually timed to the walking speed of the character and the flight speed of the bird. So you start understanding why we eventually decided to go for patches of rock that we could combine and shape the cave with, rather than one frozen, unchangeable shape. In general, the space around the camera was set to allow for later experimenting with different framing and performances of the character. From a workflow standpoint, the challenges were different. Of course, what you see here on the right is the result of a screen share brainstorming session between us and the technical guys at Unity. I found it in one of the old folders and I thought it was cool to share. Not that it is meant to mean anything really, but the point is that the movie was made within development game technology still. Like several of the tools that we were using were being developed either on request or literally during the production of this short. So there were a lot of interconnected conversations between the art and the tech. This project was never really thought to be just a movie. It was always, since the beginning, thought as a sort of a hybrid product, and we will talk about hybrid products later in the talk. The project was also a very interesting experiment because game people and movie people that were collaborating here in the project, they come from different industries, they come from different backgrounds, and they don't necessarily speak the same language. So that was also a challenge sometimes. And then there was the other challenge of having a team that was scattered across Europe. Now, Europe is not big enough to embrace too many time zones, but still working remotely is something that needs to be set up properly. And there are some challenges in it, which also we will mention later. Now, how did we kick off the project? Which ones were the fundamental goals when we first sat together to define the story? Well, we wanted to achieve first an awe-inspiring view of an overwhelming scale. We wanted to build a place where natural elements and architectural ones coexist, but maintaining their own separate essences. We wanted to achieve a mood progression from oppressive space to a hugely open. We wanted to blend ancient and futuristic structures and materials, and we wanted to have something that overall was a challenging, complex thing to realize, to push Unity's potential and to also showcase Unity's HD rendering pipeline capabilities. So what you see here on the right are the very first few concept sketches that we just put down to have something to look at when conversating during the first times. So then we started the first round of roughing up ideas, and what you have here on the right are again concept thumbnails and sketches by Georgi Simeonov. And on the left here you have the very first very rough experiments on narrowing down creative options, potential camera angles, and starting to establish some sort of rhythm, pace and storytelling to carry on with the creative discussion. As you see, conveying a sense of huge scale was one of the main goals, along with creating these magic moments of awe-inspiring discovery of the environment. Then, second round, more ideas. In this case, again, you have on the right side the sketches by Georgi, and on the left side the rough camera blockouts. In this case, we were trying to flip the world upside down because why not? In the experimental stages, you basically can try and do whatever you want. Then again, we flip the world, this time from left to right, also to accommodate a walking direction that was actually from left to right, which reads better to Western cultures. And on the right, you have the first architectural sketches and explorations. And speaking of designing the architecture, some basic statement that we wanted to stick with were having dome structures to be used upwards and downwards, depending on the case, having complex mechanical string systems driving the mechanisms of the city. We had the idea of sticking with musical instruments as an inspiration for the design, like open grand pianos and guitar bridges and such. And then we wanted architectural elements that would look ancient and futuristic at the same time. So mechanical solutions blend with high-tech accents. We also wanted to achieve a variety of structures layered through different ages in terms of environmental storytelling. So brickstones at the bottom, lower layer, and then evolving, going upwards to the metal elements at the top, on the tips of the towers. We wanted the Citadel also to feature several smaller dwellings organized in cluster to convey the feeling of a sort of a pseudo-urban environment. And then the whole place was meant to suggest the potential presence of a high-importance religious elite in the Citadel, and maybe a divine presence in the tower. All right, now, some of the visual elements that we experimented with, you don't really get to see in the very final cut, like I mentioned before. But we really wanted to experiment with things that would bring a bit more mystery and interest to the whole storytelling. In general, in the team, we shared this desire towards avoiding what I usually call as microwaved science fiction or microwaved fantasy visuals, which is basically that kind of stuff that you have seen a million times in movies and comics and illustration. I would say this is also where the musical instrument inspiration comes from. And in this case, these flowing hands were meant to add an extra layer of directionality to the storytelling and inject this sense of mystery to the whole experience, gradually being unveiled as we progressed towards the Citadel. They were very huge scale, and as such, they were also meant to suggest some highly evolved or beyond human craftsmanship. Okay. After several creative iterations, we started to commit to some of the most important principles that we really wanted to stick with. So, using the architectural elements in the distance picking out, we wanted to create some foreshadowing of architectural structure to start triggering progressively the interest of the audience, right? We wanted to inject a strong visual force from the directionality of the rock formations in the picture. And as I said before, we wanted to have this triangularity overall in the setup of the composition of this part of the environment. And what you have here on the right, of course, is not to scale. It's a rough top-down map of how we initially laid out the space. Now, the crucial point that I repeat here is that the entire environment was laid out and thought to give later on to a shooting crew the flexibility to experiment with camera angles, with lighting, with rhythm, with acting, with all of the visual components to achieve the intended rhythm and storytelling. And we will see very soon better how we actually approached this in a practical way, how we split the environment into modular pieces and achieved a certain level of flexibility into molding and changing and mix-matching the shapes, making the most of the real-time technology. And that is where we start seeing in action the convergence between game and movies, because we will see how the overall creative conversation will sound like we are making a movie, but the technical and workflow approaches, especially in the asset creation and organization, really recalls much more the way video games are made. So as you can see here, this is a rough pre-visualization of candidate camera angles, which was made with a sort of an average walking speed for a character to be motion captured later. And as you can see, the 3 points listed before here, we have some foreshadowing coming from the architectural shapes picking out in the distance. We have a strong sense of directionality given by the forms of the natural rocks. And there is this sense of triangularity to the whole place to give geometric consistency. Here you see some of the hands formations that we were experimenting with. And there we go, we carry on enforcing the same key points. The architectural shapes that before they were vaguely recognizable, now they're starting to become an actual recognizable entity. There is a strong visual force still from directionality of the rock formations, and the triangularity is stated even clearer. Okay, now this is an important moment because this is what we call the threshold moment, is a gate passing, and this is meaning a point of no return in the story. We are using doors, portals, gates in the storytelling as a mean to give the feeling as if you are in a journey that goes deeper and deeper in the adventure. And every time you pass one of these thresholds, you are each time one step deeper into approaching the discovery moment of the Citadel reveal. So the space is changing here. The structure that before was just used as a means for foreshadowing the presence of an architectural element now is declared as a huge tower in its entire scale. Given the monumental moment, now the directionality is a straight vertical line. And given that the storytelling in this specific moment is about passing the threshold, is about jumping on the other side, well, the triangularity at this point is flipped, is on the other side, right? It was leaning this way before, now it's leaning this other way. And the final vista shot, of course, went through several iterations of experimenting with rhythm, and lighting, and composition. Now, the scale of this huge tower is further reestablished. We are passing the ball of the directionality of leading the camera interest to the birds for a moment, and we start using these pits, these openings in the rock ceiling to backdrop and bring the focus where we want the focus to go. And this is how we build up to the final vista shot where, the main goal and ingredients was this awe-inspiring feeling of discovery. So at this point, selling the scale of the Citadel, especially of the central tower, is fundamental, and we make use of having sold before the giant scale of the tower, and by comparison now you see that the central tower is even bigger. The sense of strength and directionality is re-established again, and the pits are still again serving as a focus driving element to backdrop where we want the attention to go. And in the end, we decided to push down the ceiling in the foreground to create some vignetting and an extended depth. And like I mentioned before, this ceiling eventually, later on, was cracked open to reveal the sky. And now this is interesting because these extra camera angles are angles that didn't necessarily make it in the final edit. Some of them you recognize them because they did end up in the final edit. But the point is, Veselin Efremov was the director for this movie, and I never worked with him before, and I obviously didn't know his style of direction. So I didn't know if he was a fan of long epic shots or more documentary-like wide shots. What kind of rhythm does he direct the story with? So the whole idea was to experiment with the space and create a layout that was open for different tests and different approaches based on what the shooting crew wanted to do then later on, once stepping inside of it with live action cameras. So the approach was to test the space with potential candidate camera angles that could create a spectrum of possibilities, to test the flexibility of the whole environment, which would involve many considerations, such as having enough space to place the camera in different positions and frame the characters, creating a proper relationship between the character and the citadel, according also to the walking speed of the character, according to the flying speed of the bird, according to anticipating some sort of lighting layer, according to what kind of rhythm was the sequence going to have, leaving opportunities for close-up shots as much as wide shots, and so on and so forth. So to sum it up, the final goal was to have an environment that would accommodate for more explorations by the on-set crew and actors, which is the main spirit, I think, when approaching visualization with real-time graphics. And so with these preliminary creative iterations in place, we finally went on location to start the photogrammetry work. And so the goal was to have eventually a catalog of chunks of pieces that would provide enough flexibility later for a modular approach to building the cave. As you can see, this is eventually a catalog it's like a construction kit for the cave. So as we proceeded with this, we aimed at having smaller lattice-friendly patches of rock rather than huge sectors. We needed to have, of course, a consistent color temperature and an accurate albedo lineup to make sure that later our PBR system was properly ranged. We needed to retain clear, broad shapes and sharp mid-frequency features, while leaving the high-frequency details later to the tileable detail maps in the shaders inside of Unity. And we let the wetness effects and all the soft transitions from patch to patch to the decal work and to alpha strips later. And eventually this approach was flexible enough to allow us to bring all of these construction pieces, this catalog of small pieces, to mix and match and combine and come up with the shapes that we wanted to achieve, also looking from the camera and integrating with the storytelling that we wanted to achieve. And this was the full shell of the whole cave open up, as you see. This was 2 kilometers long and 500 meters tall. And eventually, while composing the final shots, our rock modules got blended together with several pieces coming from the Quixel Megascan library, which had very high quality ones available. Meanwhile, more work were proceeding in defining better the architecture for the citadel, and here you see more sketches by Georgi, specifically for the main tower and for the surrounding dwellings, and also for the giant copper poles that were meant to support the strings and the string systems from the passage all the way to the citadel. And here is some more look development work, some more shot paintovers, but most importantly here you see what I mentioned before about creating storytelling through the materials of the citadel, and specifically about layering up the different stages of construction of the citadel. So you see at the bottom we have a Neolithic layer made of huge stones, and then going up we have an ancient brick layer, which going higher transitions into a white plaster layer, and then eventually at the top layer we have weathered and oxidized metals. And this is the way you convey a backstory of an environment without saying a word, literally making the most of the semantics that materials can convey. All right, so we looked before at the construction kit that we used and we created to mix and match the organic shapes of the rocks. Now let's have a look at the construction kit that we put together for the Citadel. So when working on all of these assets, the main points were to convey a sense of scale. As mentioned before, this whole place was meant to be very huge. We needed to follow modularity and reusability principles. Well, as I said before, also it's a construction set, so this was meant to be mixed and matched based on the framing and compose the Citadel with flexibility in the later stages of production. We needed a huge set of decals, including decorations, scatter pieces, and add-ons elements to create complexity, again, in layers, scattering stuff and small details on top of the basic structures to sell the scale and to enrich the visuals. And the whole thing was meant to be very easy to kit bash and relay out quickly in clusters. All right, so now let's go and have a look at the first part of the movie in the basement. How did we build the basement? And to do that, to avoid losing the overall orientation, because it's a huge environment, let's zoom all the way out and zoom back in. So from here, the basement is that little thing. That's the outside city. Here we have the portal, tunnel, and the passage to the cave, and that is the main cave and the Citadel. So zooming in, this is the basement, and that is where the character enters from, and that's the direction of its walking path. That's the passage to the cave, that's the main cave and the Citadel, and that is where the character is walking through to eventually land on the final spot. Now, zooming further inside the basement, let's see how the different segments of the basement relate specifically to the storytelling. So let's see what is meant to happen story-wise in each segment of the basement. Segment A, the basement entrance. Now, this is the place of the main character reveal, the first setting clues, and the robot bird reveal. Segment B, the turn point. So this is the place of the basement setting reveal, because we have a wider shot of it, the first character connection clues, and the first quest purpose clues through their dialogue. Segment C, the double door. This is the first path interruption. This is the first obstacle, and this is the feeling of the stepping deeper, what I mentioned before about having different barriers and having different threshold points. And segment D, the tunnel passage to the cave, and this is where we set the fundamental question mark of what the hell is going on here. And of course, we couldn't wrap up this section of the talk without a look to the modular construction kit of the assets for the basement. Again, here as well was very important to have a consistent PBR-friendly setup with an albedo especially graded to suggest the same aging processes across all the elements to convey this feeling that all of these pieces were living in the same environment for a very long time. And to this goal, we also made good use of the HDRP lit dust blend material, which was a slop and coverage based dust layer material that was developed customly during the development of this short by the Unity Tech team. And even more importantly than in the Citadel, here in the basement, we really needed a huge set of decals and scatter pieces to create complexity and have control over its scattering across the place. So talking about these things, you see that we are talking about asset creation approaches that are very much related to how games are made. This is a very video game-like type of talk. So let's jump now how we generally approach the composition of the shots and get back into more of a movie-style type of talk. So, composition-wise, of course, we want all the basic elements to be solidly in place, which means we need force and directionality with balance. We need contrast in 4 dimensions, which means also in time, that means motion. In this case, it was very simple because the characters are the only thing moving. We want an appealing distribution of broad shapes in red, mid-size shapes in green, and high-frequency details in yellow, to have a good distribution that lets the eye breathe in and breathe out, meaning there are busy areas and less busy areas, in a good balance. And especially in this type of environments that are a bit messy and noisy by nature, composition can be tricky to control. It's very important that the focal point has no clashes in similar competing sizes, meaning that once your brain has identified the character as the main focal point, you don't want that to enter in any competition with similarly scaled elements in the environment. And of course, you want to exploit overlap to achieve depth, and to this extent, tangency is a classic enemy. Speaking of which, here we had to be very careful because we have a dangerous situation with a bold character, with a backlight, which is prone to create high specularity, and has horizontal metal beams running on top of him. So this is a classic situation where environment and lighting comes together to work in concert to achieve the best result. Now, we have spoken about asset production before, which was very much of a video game-like approach, but this kind of talk, as you can tell, is traditional movie talk, caring about composition, contrasts from specific angles. Again, this in games you don't really do unless it's some certain hero situations or like cinematic sequences. This is really camera driven. So, this is it for this first part of the talk. In the next part, we will start putting side by side the movie industry and the game industry and put them in parallel and see comparisons, how they compare in terms of their history, how they compare in terms of the tech, and how they compare in terms of their grammar.